First, I have some thank yous to Noah and to Meredith for putting this together. I didn't know anything about this group when Noah contacted me, so I'm very excited just to see it existing. And I'm flattered to be invited. I was a little surprised, I have to say. This isn't false modesty. I thought maybe 10 of my ex-students would show up. I do see some of my ex-students in the crowd, so I'm happy to see you guys here. I know how hard it is to get up at 8 in the morning for most of you, so I do know you a little bit. So yes, to Noah and to Meredith. I also heard, though, that Lauren did the poster, so the poster is very lovely. And I heard that she had to do it because my students refused to do it. So I don't know what that says. Maybe it says I've scared them to death. But, you know, be that as it may, it came out beautifully. And so I hope the rest of you will get braver in the future. Okay, so let's get started. When Noah said you need to talk about end, I thought, okay, you know, pretty interesting, pretty strange, and a little ominous given the times we live in. So I thought I would complicate it a little more by saying I'm going to talk about odds and ends. Odds being the probability of something, the probability of an end being a kind of closure. I want to open that back up and talk about it as a kind of opening. An opening in different kinds of ways, though. I think it's pretty clear that most of you would agree that an ending can be a beginning. But I think it's even a little more nuanced than that about what kind of beginnings we might be talking about. I should say a little bit about how I'm going to go about this. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think about design. I'm a designer, I'm a writer, I'm a teacher. I think that gets confusing for people that don't know really what we do. They say, oh yeah, you know, she's a professor at UH. In fact, my landlord always says, if I'm not a teaching day, he says, so you're not working today? And I say, no, I'm always working. But, you know, they think that we're in the classroom. That's a third of what we normally do. So you'll see a little bit of that today. The first thing that I thought of course, is, you know, the end or an end, right? And I think in most of my work and the way I try to approach my students, I always want to think of it as an end. That doesn't mean it's nebulous or unclear, or that it isn't a meaningful pause in something. But usually it's less definitive as a final end. So I got thinking about it and I thought, ends. Are they spatial? Are they temporal? Are they positive? Are they negative? They're all of those things, right? So if we think about ends, high end, dead end, split end, you know, they've got a physicality to them. But they also have time. You know, the final stage of something, the peak of something, the denouement of something, which is a resolution. Those have a positive spin to them, not a negative one. You know, we're reaching the end of something, some kind of achievement. Of course, on the other side, we've got the negative, which is the, well, sort of negative, you know, the looming end, you know, the year 2000, the fin du siècle, you know, something's going to happen, the last breath, and of course, the apocalypse. When someone heard I was talking about ends, they said, oh dear, you know, because it's the first thing that one goes to. But it's not necessarily the most interesting. So, this is what I'm interested in. The certain, the uncertain. Can an end be an edge, a horizon, a coda, a pause in something? Because all space, all boundaries, are really just moments to be transgressed. So if we think about how territory of any kind is demarked, it becomes a kind of zone of possibility. You know, I always think of these edges between countries, of moments where something can happen. They also become territories of interest, right? When something is black and white, it's less interesting. I always tell my students, they have an idea. I said, it's not an interesting idea unless I can disagree with it. Otherwise, it's just kind of a fact, right? So to be provocative in some way. And for designers, this gets tricky, right? Because you think about something being useful. They said, yes, but I've got a client and it has to function. It has to be clear communication. And I always say, what is that exactly, right? In what context, given what situation, given what audience, given what medium? Clear communication is a little bit of a gray area in itself. So I think it's more interesting to think about it as a mode of creative practice, right? An action of a kind. Because it's only there that we think about how networks connect, right? How that moment in time, it's almost like a pause, can be meaningful. So I once had dinner with the writer Paul Theroux, who lives on the island here. And we were talking about writing, and he said, yes, but one has to come to the discipline of conclusion. And I thought, yeah, that's right, on a certain level. But maybe that can be for that time, that moment, that particular situation where it's more meaningful. And to do that, I think as designers in this day and age is even more critical. I grew up in a generation, I studied with Paul Rand, Armin Hoffman, Bradbury Thompson, you know, all pillars of design history. And they came from a kind of mid-century thought about design, where design is, you know, you produce the best thing. Massimo Vignelli said to me once, yes, but before you test something, you first have to know how. And I thought, that's a particular way of seeing what knowledge is, right? But if we look at knowledge as a kind of a way to reveal new dimensions of something, something we hadn't considered, and to get other people involved in it, then it changes a bit. It's not so cut and dry. So, objects or practices. And I think one of the great things that the digital world, I started without digital media. I was back of the generation of cut and paste. We had to put everything down for the printer. I learned how to do all that stuff on light tables. What a hassle, right? So now it's kind of a lot easier and a lot more complicated, because for the first time, designers have to really know what it is they add. Because you can't just say, it used to be you could say, well, you don't know how to do this. It's magic. It happens in a back room, and I'll take care of it for you. Pay me $150 an hour. Now they have to say, well, my kid can do that on Photoshop, so then what is it that we add? And I would say it's a way of thinking about a kind of practice, as opposed to the object itself. It's hard to do, because I think in our discipline, we still idolize the object. We do it in art, we do it in design, there are competitions, you win, someone looks at it for 50 seconds who has a studio in East Texas, and they say, you're the winner. And it's like, based on what? Did you even know how that worked, or why it worked that way, or what was good about it as compared to something else? And I think in this day and age, where people are more entrepreneurial, that's going to come around, and it's already starting. So here's some examples of just put in 3 examples of studios that I like and that I think are trying to do this in different ways. This is Graphic Thought Facility in London. They do a lot of different kinds of work, but this is, again, a sense of an open ending. This is just some storage boxes that they produce for a client. They're double-walled, and they have matrices on each side so they can be customized by the user, just by punching the holes out. You can say what you want it to say. You can use it as signage. You can use it as storage. You can flatten it out and ship it. It's kind of great. This one I love. This is one of my favorite studios. These are all still working studios. This is Experimental Jet Set. They're in New York and Amsterdam, and in 2011 they were commissioned to redo the identity for the Whitney Museum in New York. Big job with something that's that iconic. The Whitney's been there since 1930. It's a big institution in New York, and so, you know, whoever is going to do it is going to get some pushback. What was lovely about this is what they called the responsive W. And every time it's applied in a different way. So it responds to the art, it responds to the shape of the art, it responds to the city. When they actually explained, I watched them explain why they did it once, and they said they did it as a line being the most fundamental piece of art, a line being the assumed distance between past and future in the history of art, and the W being sort of the pulse of the city. The Whitney being an institution in the city that's a kind of pulse of the city. They finally implemented it, but as you can see, it's different for everything, so wherever it gets applied, it changes. Then we get into teaching. I think it's pretty clear, I'm sure the word is out, that when I teach, I don't necessarily do commercial projects. I've gotten a lot of pushback from the city on this. Designers in town, how come, you know, John Doe doesn't know how to use this version of Photoshop? For me, it's more about developing a way of thinking. I tell my students, I'm a graphic designer. It's been good for me. I enjoy it. What I care about is that you become an interesting thinker and able to apply that to whatever you do. Students who are in the audience now have heard me say that more than once. So it's important to think about how do we develop that through visuality. This is a group, this was a couple of students at the Rietveld Academy in Amsterdam who decided to do a study on posters called Focal Point. Amsterdam is a city of posters, like many cities in Europe, and what they did was they took 220 posters, figured out what the focal point of each one of those was visually, cut that focal point out, and superimpose them on top of each other to see if there was any similarity between a kind of way of seeing and the street. Pretty interesting, right? As it turned out that the actual final, and this is just a stage of it, that the actual final one corresponded perfectly to the classic golden section. And those poster designers weren't talking to each other. So interesting, both positive and negative, I think. I put this is the lead into my work. I put it like this because I want you to know that I will stop talking at some point. And that my work is about this open-endedness. And I want you to know that I walk the walk. I don't just try to get my students to do it. I want to do it every time I do a project. So I'm always trying to reimagine what that project can be, to test the nature of the design world as well as the technology that we use. For a long time, every time Matt Heim would see me coming, he would he'd like roll his eyes going, oh God, Anne's gonna wanna do something weird with the press again, you know? Why don't you do a rack brochure or something? So I've been, now we hear a lot about self-generated projects, but I've been doing these for a long time, not to be cool, but mainly because they were a way for me to test out things I wanted to test out. A lot of this was about site specificity, but I think of all visual projects as a relationship to site, whether it's the site of the book, whether it's the site of the street, whether it's the site of the screen or non-site of the screen. This was a project that I did down in First Hawaiian Bank. You'll recognize the lobby if you've been down there, and there's a catwalk up above. There's a mezzanine behind that screen. It's actually a metal screen that my piece is on. The Contemporary Museum asked me to do a piece. They wanted it in the mezzanine. I said, what about that big metal screen? And they said, okay. And then I told them what I was going to do, and they rolled their eyes. Because it was also a little dangerous. The preparator had to get up on a ladder on the catwalk. So then he's 70 feet above because this is about, well, I guess it's about 25 feet by about 15 feet, and then it's a drop to the floor. So it's a little dangerous, right? And you can see I made all the sections in my studio, and then got back of my friend's pickup truck and drove him downtown. Part of what I wanted to do here was to think about what it means to be visual in a bank. And you say, okay, it's money, right? But for me, the interesting thing about art is that art has no value, right? It only has assigned value. So can money be art then? And so that was the starting point for this. It's illegal to cut money, so I tried to figure out how to fold the money to make the letters so that you would see only George Washington's head, or the amount of it to spell the word trust. Then the museum got all upset and said, people are going to go out, oh, by the way, this is $6,200 of my own money. And you can't get it. I had to get it from the U.S. Mint, and then they brought it out to the credit union and counted it out like some kind of backroom deal. Because you can't get that many $1 bills, but it was all very interesting to me. And I took out an advance on my credit card. I don't have $6,200 laying around. And so then the museum got upset because they said, well, people can walk out there and they can take it. So we can't insure it. And I said, you don't have to. It's a bank. No one's ever going to believe that anyone's stupid enough to put real money within someone's grasp. So now we're playing with whether someone believes it or not. And the interesting thing, I think, as you can see a little bit, is from the lobby, it only looks faintly like money. You don't really know. You think, that looks familiar. And as you walked up the stairs, people became more aware that it actually was money. And you could go up and take it. It turned out no one did, although a lot of people went up and felt it because they didn't believe it was money. I took it down, took it apart, put it back in the bank, paid off my credit card. Cost me about $30 to make. Then I made these cards because part of the issue was to play with the word trust as well. And these cards went into where you can see over here where you fill out your deposit slips. I slipped them in there in a kind of guerrilla style. The bank wouldn't let me do it, but I did it anyway. And what they talked about was the lack of money going into public education in the state of Hawaii. So then it's, who can we trust? Can I trust you in front of my work? Can you trust your legislature? Can you trust each other? This is a piece that I did with my friend, Alan Bromley, who's in the audience today, up at the Contemporary Museum. Alan was having a retrospective of her work and asked me to collaborate with her on a project. I told her, because again, I want to use the parts of design to think about design. Designed money, designed books, which is what this is. These are the catalogs from the Contemporary Museum. And what we ended up doing was cutting out the pages and then slicing the pages. And what was interesting about it, and we spent, I don't know, a couple months doing it, is that we would meet, and it was always interesting to find out what the paper would do. It was about the speed of the cut, the dullness of the blade, the width of the cut, gave us different kinds of results. So what we ended up doing was taking the pictures out of the catalog of everything that had been shown in that gallery. Then we reinstalled them as objects back in the gallery. So then it goes from object to representation back to object. This was a catalog for that same show, for Alan's work. I wanted to show not just installation work. And when Alan asked me to do this, I said yes, yes, yes. And then I was thinking, this is tricky because Alan's a printmaker. Usually the goal of a printmaker is do the perfect edition. Can I make 10 prints, 20 prints, 50 prints that all look identical? But Alan doesn't do that. She makes a one-off. She's a screen printer. She makes it like a painter would. She's not doing 10 of them. So how do I make a catalog? Because catalogs are multiples. How do I make a catalog that's both universal and unique? And how do I do it with the medium of printing itself? So this is one where Matt said, oh dear. But if you're a graphic designer, you know when you get a press going, you have to get paper on the press, and you have to get the ink up on the press. So you have a whole stack of make-readies. You get extra paper, goes through the press, and you usually do it with the plates that you're printing. So that means the book, as it's laid out in the imposition on the plate, gets printed on the make-readies. So what I did was I told the guys down at Electric Pencil, I said, put that paper through the press, print only one side, then turn it around and put it through again, and turn it around and put it through again. So they did that. So this is all the make-readies from the print job that actually printed the book that we then folded into individual covers for every book. So universal and unique. Another catalog I did was for a show we had at UH called Sum of the Parts. And when the person asked me to do the catalog, I said, is it some S-O-M-E or some S-U-M? And then she said, well, it's kind of both. I said, good. This will be fun. So, and it was a show about artists who use body parts in their work. So the book is in 5 signatures. They're unbound. 3 of them that have the text are entirely transparent. The 2 that have the images are opaque. And they got handed to people in bags, basically. Again, not to be clever, but to think about the idea of interactivity. How can someone handle it? They're also, the proportion is also the size of my hand. So my director at Yale, when I was there, said to me once, he said, a book should be the size of a human hand. And there's some logic to that, right? That's why they call them coffee table books, or books you read, because you can hold them in your hand. This final project of mine is a project that I did in Venice in 2014. I was a fellow at a print studio there. And part of the reason I wanted to go there was to do something in the city. Anytime I get a chance to do a site-specific work, I'm like really excited and thankful. This piece is called Controspazio, punti in aria, which means counter space, points in air. Punti in aria is the lace that they make on the island of Burano in the lagoon, the Venetian lagoon. And it's a kind of lace that has points but no backing, just the thread between the points. A lot of lace has a kind of dense backing. And it struck me when I went to the Lace Museum how much that was indicative of the lagoon itself. The various islands in the lagoon, but also in the Rialto, the main part of Venice where most people visit, the various piazzas and the strips between them, where you don't really know what's coming. The theorist Michel de Certeau said, the wonderful thing about being in the city is you don't see the city. You can only see it above, usually. And so when you're in it, you're kind of maneuvering through it. So that was a starting point. I also wanted to use graphic design, so I collected postcards I was there for 7 months. I collected postcards for 5 months. So here are 847 unique views of Venice from postcards that I actually cut out and then perforated. And I did 847 because the change in the amount of tourists between 2010 and 2014 was 847,000 new tourists to the Venetian lagoon, which is another whole discussion. Here's a close-up. And then on the opposing wall were a series of stickers that you could take, and then I got the city to hang posters throughout the Centro Storico, the old part of the city. That was a big negotiation. I had to, in my bad Italian. But it was interesting to work with them. So I had them print these posters, which you can see there in the center. It says Contraspazio Punti in Aria. Obviously, I'm using the counterspace of the letters, being a graphic designer. So the stickers go in there. And you can either start at the poster and go back to the gallery and then go back to the poster, because the poster tells you how to do it. Or you start in the gallery, go out to the poster, and add your sticker. So there was a lot of kind of moving between the city and the space of the gallery. Also between what you thought of Venice. So it's a very simple question. Venice is, Venezia è. What is it to you? I should say something about this. In 2016, I was one of 9 studios internationally to win a honor award from the Society of Environmental Design, SEGD. Experiential design, I should say. They used to be environmental design. And, you know, I submitted this. I always do it with a certain amount of resistance because I want things to be recognized for their value, not their beauty. Beauty's part of it, but only a part of it. So I'd submitted it, and it always costs money. We all know that. Anybody who's ever put stuff in a show, you always have to write a check. And I thought, oh, this is ridiculous. You know, I'm not an exhibition designer. You know, the Metropolitan's going to put their stuff in, or the Museum of Modern Art. You know, come on. So I called them back, and I said, you know, I just entered something, but I think I want to pull it out. And she said, well, why don't you just wait and see? I said, oh, all right, it's already in there. Then she called me about 2 weeks later and said, Anne? And I said, yeah. So needless to say, then I flew to the award ceremony. And when they announced it, I realized, you know, because you have to put the budget, right? So the budgets were the Moscow subway, $1 million, the wayfinding system for the Moscow subway, the Walk New York, signage system in New York. I don't know how many, you know, that was. Stuff for the Whitney, and me. And my little thing that said $1,000 to make, which I was kind of proud of. But needless to say, the MC didn't know how to introduce it. He said, and here's a piece that's, yeah. Okay, and then some student work. I'm sorry, I'm talking too long. I just wanted to show how I do this with students as well, or try to get students set up situations where students can explore this for themselves. One of the projects I love to do is give a project called Eccentric Spaces. Give them a section of the city and say, you have to do 2 books, design 2 books, one of which talks about that particular section of the city as a public space, and one that talks about it as a private space. I did this once with my colleague who used to be my student, and he took all his pictures in. I gave him Kaimuki, and he took all his pictures in the Goodwill up there. And I said, oh, you misunderstood the project. And he said, hear me out. I said, okay. He said, if you think about Goodwill, it's the perfect intersection of public and private space. I said, okay, we can change that then. That's good. This one is Chinatown. The student took the book, made it into 2 different grids, a Western and an Eastern grid, and the book is totally circular. So you can see that it's bound in a way that you get the main book, and then there's a book at the end that turns the whole book around and starts again. This was a piece for the School of Architecture. They wanted some promotional materials that said that they were about sustainability and an architecture school that was between East and West. So, okay. So the students came up with the idea to basically take Western paper sizes and fold them in Eastern ways. We also got everything out of 1 sheet of paper. So it's sustainable too. 1 press sheet are all these pieces because every piece does double duty. The envelope is actually the newsletter. The folder, if you fold it another way, actually becomes the brochure. And this was miraculously printed by Hagedorn, who's no longer in business. But what was exciting about that is the printers were all over it. You know, they're like, okay, let's try this. You know, they were really excited. I think sometimes it gets kind of dull back there. So they were really excited and did a beautiful job. It worked perfectly. You can see the press sheet. This is the press sheet up in the upper Right. I also try to give, every year we have a BFA show, and when I'm doing it, I always have the students design the gallery. It's a chance to work in space and to think about how one communicates in space versus through, from a distance. This was a project we did for the UH Department of Theater and Dance. They wanted an identity system, and we thought, theater and dance, you know, what's the common denominator there? Performance, of course. So the students came up with this idea, live on stage, live on stage. How do we use language and its multiplicity to think about meaning? The wonderful thing about that was when they set it up, they wanted the chairs facing out. So who is the audience when you're looking at this? And all the pieces for the identity system, I prefer that word, by the way. All you guys that use branding, stop that. You know, branding always feels like somebody's doing something to somebody, you know, sticking something. You know, it's like, whoa. But identity system, I'm helping you define this. And it's open, it's a system, right? Which is the way it should work. So they did t-shirts that had, you know, it would say all the action verbs as well as the verbs in Hawaiian. The X was kind of the mark. That's the mark on stage for where you stand when you're performing. And so we sent out the posters, were also the brochures again, only they worked in reverse. The poster, you could be hung up, and when it was done, you could cut along certain lines, fold it, and it became a book again. And then last, we are coming to the end, an end. This is Project Public. I'd like to give the students in the advanced type class a project where I introduce them to other design disciplines because I think we're all related. So they have to take, I give them an architect that's won the Pritzker Prize, which is the big prize in architecture. They have to research that architect, think about the way they work, and do a poster, a book, a series of cards, and some kind of container that represents the philosophy of that architect without showing their work. So the idea is to do it as if the architect did it. Like get under the hood, think about what that architect is looking at and how they're thinking. So this is Rem Koolhaas. He did a famous flag, international flag, that has these colors and looks a lot like this. So what the student did, this is the poster, is this is a series of actual stickers that can be put up around town, and then they can be taken off and replaced other places in town. Then you can actually, he set up an Instagram site where you could take a picture of it and people could comment on it again on Instagram. So the actual project not only represented the way Rem Koolhaas thinks about the city as an interactive space, but how that works between virtual and real. And then just to close, I just wanted to suggest this, that ends are beginnings. Don't count that out. Don't let anybody talk you out of it. I used to have clients and they'd say, you know, people would look at my work and say, oh, I never get projects like that. I'd say, neither do I. Projects like that are made. You know, be the person that can have that discussion with somebody. Not because you want to win awards, because you want to push what design can be, what art can be, what visuality can be, meaning. So, we're at an end.